The public garden on Velrath Station was the kind of place that existed because someone in the early design schematics had written morale infrastructure in a budget column and nobody had questioned it. It had an open ceiling that displayed a rotating sky program, currently set to something called Terran afternoon, variant 4 asterisk, which meant the light was the particular gold of a sun that was not actually there, falling across plants that had never grown on any planet, arranged by a landscaping algorithm that had made its peace with aesthetic compromise. It was, despite all of this, Samuel's favorite place on the station, partly because of the plants, which did not need anything from him, mostly because it was the one location on Velrath where his comm badge's work frequency had, by some gracious accident of signal architecture, absolutely no reception. He had been sitting on his bench for 20 minutes and had successfully thought about nothing of consequence. This was an achievement. The week had been the kind of week that accumulated. A coolant routing dispute between decks 7 and 9 that had somehow become his problem. A shipment of biological samples that had arrived without documentation and could not legally be moved in any direction until someone senior signed something that the senior person in question was refusing to sign, until a different form was filed first. And a meeting on Thursday that had been described in the invitation as a asterisk brief alignment session, and had lasted 4 hours and produced no alignment whatsoever. Samuel had left his office at 2:30, told his workstation he was doing a site inspection, and come here. He had been watching a pigeon, or the station's equivalent, some small gray bird from a consignment that had escaped a habitat module 3 years ago, and colonized the garden with the self-satisfied permanence of a species that has decided a problem is solved, when he became aware that he was being watched in return. Not by the bird. The bird had the decency to pretend he didn't exist. The watcher was small, perhaps 6 years old, positioned in the overgrowth to his left with a stillness that suggested either excellent patience or a recent and total physical freeze. She had blue skin, deep and even, and ears that curved to long tapered points from which small braided cords hung with what he recognized, vaguely, as ceremonial intent. Her eyes were dark and very focused, and she was looking at him with the specific evaluative quality of a child who has been watching for some time and is now in the final stage of a decision-making process. Samuel offered a neutral smile. This was a mistake, in the sense that it was an invitation he had not fully considered before extending. The girl moved from the overgrowth to the bench beside him with the efficiency of someone who has received the confirmation they required. She sat. She arranged herself. She looked forward at the garden with the composure of a diplomat who has just secured favorable terms. They sat together for a moment in silence. The bird pecked at something near the path. Terran afternoon, variant 4 did its best overhead. Somewhere deeper in the garden, a water feature that Samuel had always found faintly aggressive continued its aggressive water feature sounds. Then the girl reached over, found his hand with both of hers, and held it with the absolute assurance of someone who has already resolved any uncertainty on this matter internally and does not anticipate disagreement. She looked up at him. She said, in standard, with the clear enunciation of a child who has learned a second language and wants you to know it, "Be my father, human." Samuel sat very still. He looked at her small hands around his, which were managing the task of holding his hand with a structural seriousness that suggested this was not a casual arrangement. He looked at the artificial sky. He looked at the bird, which had stopped pecking and appeared, with the blank neutrality of small station wildlife, to be offering no guidance. He took a long, slow breath. He was a man who had learned, through a series of instructive experiences he did not enjoy thinking about, that the first thing that arrived in his mouth in a surprising moment was not always the correct thing to send out into the world. So he held it there, the breath, the moment, the small warm weight of her hands, and let the garden continue around him at its usual pace, and did not speak yet and simply acknowledged to himself, with the careful honesty of a logistics coordinator assessing an unexpected manifest, that this was not a situation he had any existing procedure for. The bird went back to pecking. The water feature continued its agenda. Sova, though he did not know her name yet, would not know it for another 4 minutes, waited beside him with the patient confidence of someone who has asked a reasonable question and sees no cause for alarm in the pause. Her name was Sova. She offered this information approximately 90 seconds after her initial proposal, in the tone of someone who has realized a procedural gap and is correcting it efficiently. She pointed at herself. She said the name. Then she pointed at him with the expectant patience of a person waiting for a system to complete a required field. "Samuel," he said. She repeated it, testing the syllables with the focused expression of someone entering a new entry into a personal database. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied with the result, and returned to holding his hand. What followed was a conversation in the loosest technical sense of the word. A negotiation between two people who shared approximately 40 words of common language, supplemented by gesture, expression, and in two memorable instances, sounds that Samuel made in an attempt to mime "Where are your parents?" that the bird observed with what he could only describe as concern. Sova, for her part, communicated with the efficient confidence of a child who has never found a language barrier particularly interesting as an obstacle. She pointed. She demonstrated. At one point she stood on the bench, which Samuel felt was a structural escalation, to indicate a direction that he interpreted as somewhere past the eastern habitat ring. From this, he assembled the following. She had come from that direction. There were people with her who were no longer with her. This was, in her estimation, not an emergency. He got the impression, from the particular lightness with which she described the situation, that she considered the separation less a problem than a natural consequence of the other parties failing to keep up. "We should probably find them," Samuel said. Sova agreed with this in the way that a person agrees with a suggestion they find reasonable but not urgent. She climbed down from the bench. She did not release his hand. He registered this and decided, on reflection, that it was not a battle worth selecting. They walked together through the garden at the pace of a small person who finds everything worth examining. Sova stopped twice, once to investigate a plant that had grown over the path in a way she found structurally interesting, and once to look at the water feature with an expression of profound critical assessment. Samuel watched her look at the water feature and thought, with the sideways part of his brain that continued to function even during unusual situations, that he had looked at that water feature many times and never had a thought about it as specific as whatever she was currently having. He noticed, as they walked, the details that had not resolved themselves at distance. The braided cords on her ears were not decorative in the casual sense. There was a pattern to them, a specific arrangement that had the quality of something intentional, something that meant something to someone. Her clothing was plain in color, but not in construction. And at her collar, almost hidden by the line of her coat, there was a small embroidered insignia that Samuel recognized in the vague way that a person recognizes something they have seen on official documents and never expected to encounter on a 6-year-old standing on a bench. He was still organizing this observation into something coherent when the attaché appeared. He came around the curve of the eastern hedge path at a pace that was technically walking, but contained the full emotional content of running. A tall Velrathi man in formal station dress, long ears slightly disordered from the speed of his recent movement, wearing the expression of someone who has had a very bad 20 minutes and has just seen the reason for them standing calmly beside a human in a garden. He stopped. His eyes went to Sova, then to Samuel, then to their joined hands. His face, in the space of about 3 seconds, moved through relief, confusion, a rapid private calculation, and then settled into a professional composure that Samuel recognized as the expression of a man who has decided to manage the situation rather than experience it. He addressed Sova in Velrathi. His tone had the careful quality of someone who is very concerned, but has made a decision not to express this at full volume in a public space. Sova responded. Her Velrathi was brief, confident, and contained what Samuel suspected was a summary of the last 20 minutes that framed events entirely from her own perspective. The attaché looked at Samuel. Samuel said, "I found her in the garden." Or she found me. The distinction felt important to her. The attaché absorbed this. He introduced himself as Reth, aide to the Velrathi delegation, and said that the station's diplomatic quarter extended its apologies for any disruption. His standard was precise, and had the quality of language learned from formal texts, which meant it was perfectly correct and occasionally slightly strange, like a building that has been constructed entirely from architectural diagrams without anyone walking through it first. "There was no disruption," Samuel said. "We looked at a water feature." Reth looked at the water feature in question. He seemed to feel, from his expression, that this was not what the morning had been intended to produce. He looked back at Samuel with the careful expression of someone who is adding a human logistics coordinator to a situation that did not previously contain one, and is assessing the implications. Sova, still holding Samuel's hand, said something else in Velrathi. Reth's careful expression became briefly and involuntarily more complicated. "What did she say?" Samuel asked. Reth paused for exactly the length of time it takes a person to decide between accuracy and diplomacy, and then said, "She said she has made her selection, and that you have been informed." Samuel looked down at Sova. Sova looked up at him with the serene confidence of someone whose administrative paperwork is in order. The artificial afternoon light fell across the garden with its usual golden indifference, and somewhere behind them the water feature continued, as it always did, entirely on its own agenda. Samuel had every intention of returning to his office. This was not a passive intention. He had said it out loud to Reth in the garden, with the clear and reasonable tone of a man who has a coolant routing dispute waiting for him and a biological sample shipment that exists in a legal gray zone and a workstation he has told a lie to. He had said goodbye to Sova, who had received this information with the polite patience of someone who does not consider it final. He had walked 14 steps in the direction of the eastern corridor before Reth, with the pained courtesy of a man executing instructions he did not choose, had said that the delegation would very much appreciate a brief formal acknowledgement, as a matter of diplomatic record, and that it would take no more than 20 minutes. Samuel had looked at the corridor. He had looked at Reth. He had thought about the biological samples which were not going anywhere, legally or physically. He had gone with Reth. That had been 40 minutes ago. The reception room he was sitting in now was the kind of room that had been designed to communicate something specific to anyone who entered it. And what it communicated, clearly and without subtlety, was that the people who occupied it were operating on a different scale of consequence than the people visiting it. The ceiling was high. The materials were real in a way that station materials usually weren't, actual wood in the paneling, or something so precisely engineered to replicate it that the distinction had stopped being meaningful. The chair Samuel was sitting in was more comfortable than his bed. On the low table before him sat a cup of tea that had been brought by a person whose entire bearing suggested that the tea was not something to be treated casually, which had the effect of making Samuel acutely aware of everything he was doing with his hands. He had been waiting for 11 minutes. He knew this because he had checked his comm, which had reception here, and then immediately felt guilty about checking it in this room, and then felt slightly ridiculous for feeling guilty about checking a comm in a chair, and then had a brief internal conversation with himself about whether he was allowed to drink the tea before the person he was waiting for arrived, which he had resolved, tentatively, in the direction of waiting. The door opened. Mara entered without the architecture of entrance that Samuel had been, without fully admitting it to himself, preparing for. No attendants preceding her, no formal announcement, no particular arrangement of the room's attention. She simply came in, the way a person comes into a room they are responsible for, and the room's atmosphere adjusted around her the way atmosphere does around someone accustomed to it adjusting. She was tall, composed in the way that suggested composure was a practice rather than a default, and she wore something that had structure without being severe. Her ears, long and tapering like Sova's, carried the same braided cords but more of them, arranged with a complexity that Samuel understood instinctively to be significant without being able to read what it signified. She looked like a woman who had been doing something important before this, and would be doing something important after, and had allocated the space between with the careful economy of someone whose time is a finite and managed resource. She thanked him for coming. Her standard was fluent and direct, without the formal stiffness of Reth's. She sat across from him and said that Sova was well, was with her attendants, and had spent the walk back to the diplomatic quarter telling anyone who would listen the full account of the morning in considerable detail. "How did it come across?" Samuel asked. "Favorably," Mara said, with the dry precision of a woman reporting accurate data. "She described you as a good sitter." Samuel considered this. "That might be the most honest assessment I've received professionally." Something moved briefly in her expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one, the kind that a person allows when they have decided, on short notice, that they like something. She asked if he would like tea. He said he had been wondering about that. She said he should have simply drunk it, and he had the distinct impression that this was also an accurate assessment of his character that she had arrived at quickly. They talked carefully. She asked about his work on the station, the kind of questions that were polite in form but genuinely attentive in execution, and he found himself answering with more honesty than he had intended, explaining the coolant dispute and the undocumented biological samples with the resigned candor of a man who has stopped performing competence for the day. She listened with the quality of attention that is rarer than it should be, the kind that does not wait for its turn to speak, but actually receives what is being said and does something with it. She made a remark about the samples that indicated she understood bureaucratic obstruction from the other side of it, with a fluency that made him think that sovereign leadership and logistics coordination might have more in common than the respective job titles suggested. He was in the middle of this thought when the curtain on the far side of the room moved. It moved with the specific quality of a curtain being held aside by someone who is trying to do this quietly and has not fully succeeded. Samuel looked at it. Mara looked at it with the expression of a woman who has identified the source of the movement and is making a decision about how to respond. The curtain settled. A small hand remained visible at its edge for a moment and then withdrew. Mara said, without turning her head in Velrathi, something short and even. There was a pause of the kind that precedes a child deciding that the instruction they have just received is technically being followed. Then Sova came out from behind the curtain, walked across the room with the measured dignity of someone making an entrance they have decided is justified, stood beside Samuel's chair, and pointed at him with the same decisive certainty she had deployed in the garden. She said something to her mother in Velrathi. It was brief and structured, and had, even across the language barrier, the distinct quality of a formal recommendation being submitted through the correct channels. Samuel looked at Mara. Mara looked at Sova with the expression of a woman who is choosing, in real time, between several possible responses and has landed on honesty. "She says," Mara said, "that she has completed her evaluation, that her decision stands, and that she would like it noted for the record." The tea had gone slightly cool. The room held its expensive silence. Samuel looked at Sova, who was watching him with the patient certainty of someone who has done everything correctly and is waiting for the relevant systems to catch up. He picked up his tea, he drank it. It was, despite the temperature, excellent. "Noted," he said. He laughed. It arrived without permission, the way genuine laughter does, not the managed social kind that a person produces in rooms like this, correctly sized and correctly timed, but the real variety, which is helpless and slightly too large and does not consult the situation before arriving. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was, in the context of a formal reception room in a diplomatic quarter, with a sovereign of a Velrathi delegation sitting across from him, absolutely the wrong size for the space. He got it under control. He set down the tea. He looked at Mara with the expression of a man preparing a genuine apology and found that he did not need to deliver it, because Mara was smiling, not the adjacent territory he had seen earlier, but the actual thing, which had clearly been waiting behind the diplomatic composure for longer than the last 5 minutes. It changed her face in the way that a real smile changes a face that has been holding something careful. And for a moment the room, which had been communicating its scale and consequence very effectively, seemed to forget what it was supposed to be doing. Sova looked between them with the satisfied expression of someone whose presentation has been well received. What came after that was different from what had come before. Not dramatically different. The room was still the room. The tea was still the tea. But the particular tension that had been sitting in the conversation like an undocumented biological sample, present and unaddressed, had shifted into something that allowed more room to move. Mara settled back slightly in her chair. Samuel stopped being aware of his hands. She told him about the selection process with the dry precision of a woman who has had 4 months to develop a sense of humor about it, even if the humor is of the variety that sits very close to something else. Sova had begun it, she explained, in the 3rd month after they had arrived on Velrath Station, wandering into public spaces with her attendants and sitting near people. Not interacting, not approaching, simply sitting. And then, after a period of assessment that varied in length depending on what she observed, either losing interest and moving on, or remaining. The attendants had learned to allow it, she said, because preventing it had proven more complicated than the alternative, and Sova's determination had a quality that made direct opposition feel less like parenting, and more like trying to hold a position against a siege conducted with complete patience and no artillery. Most people, Mara continued, had failed in one of 2 directions. Either they performed, became louder, more attentive, more deliberately charming in the way adults become when they are aware of being evaluated by a child and want to be found acceptable, or they became visibly uncomfortable and began to catalog their exits. A senior trade attaché from a human delegation had, upon noticing Sova's attention, delivered a small speech about interstellar goodwill that Sova had listened to in full, and then walked away from without expression, which Mara said she had found privately one of the more entertaining things that had happened since their arrival. Samuel had offered a neutral smile and moved over on the bench. "I genuinely just thought she wanted to sit down," he said. "I know," Mara said. "That was, apparently, the correct answer." He asked then, with the care of a man choosing his words as he goes, what the selection process was selecting for. He asked it as a practical question, as a logistics question, as the kind of question that wants to understand the parameters before it addresses the outcome. Mara was quiet for a moment in the way that a person is quiet when they are deciding how much of an honest answer to give, and then gave him the honest answer, because he had asked it honestly and he was beginning to understand, a person who responded to the quality of the question being asked. Sova's father had died 2 years ago. A circulatory condition, rare, fast, and without sufficient warning to be anything other than what it was a before and an after with almost no distance between them. Sova had been 4. She had not, as children sometimes do, retreated into the loss or been visibly consumed by it. She had instead, after a period of interior processing that Mara described with a kind of exhausted wonder, arrived at the conclusion that the situation had a practical dimension that could be addressed practically. She wanted a father. She had decided to find one. She had conducted the search with the systematic thoroughness of a child who has not yet learned that some problems are not logistics problems, And Mara had watched this with the complicated love of a parent who knows the lesson will arrive eventually and is not in a hurry to be the one who teaches it. Samuel sat with this for a moment. "She's 6, he said. "She will be 7 in 8 weeks, Mara said, "and she would like me to point out, if it is relevant, that she is very mature for her age." Samuel looked at Sova, who had arranged herself on the end of the settee nearest his chair, and was following the conversation with the focused attention of a senior advisor monitoring a negotiation. She met his look with steady, patient certainty. "She's been listening to all of this," he said. "She has been listening to all of this," Mara confirmed. "How much of my standard does she actually understand?" Mara considered this with the expression of a person doing an honest calculation. "Enough," she said. He thought about his apartment, which had one room configured as a secondary space that currently housed his additional equipment cases, and a coffee machine he had named Gerald because it had a personality. He thought about his position on the station, mid-level, functional, the kind of role that fills itself and does not generate much orbital debris. He thought about the coolant dispute, which was still waiting, and the biological samples, which were still illegal to move, and his workstation, which believed he was doing a site inspection and was not entirely wrong. "I'm a logistics coordinator," he said, with the honesty of a man filing an accurate manifest. "I have a small apartment and a coffee machine named Gerald." Mara looked at him steadily. "I am aware," she said. Sova, without looking up from her careful monitoring of the room, said something in Velrathi. Samuel looked at Reth, who had been standing near the door with the professional stillness of a man pretending not to be part of the conversation. Reth said, with the neutral expression of someone delivering a message they did not compose, "She says she also approves of Gerald." The room held its silence. Outside the diplomatic quarters viewports, Velrath Station continued its patient rotation, indifferent to the particular configuration of people inside it, as stations are. Samuel looked at the ceiling. He took a breath. He looked at Mara, who was watching him with the careful attention of a woman who is not going to make this easier and does not think she should, and at Sova, who was watching him with the complete calm of someone who made this decision weeks ago and is simply waiting for the paperwork to arrive. "Gerald," he said, "is going to need a moment." What followed was not a decision. Samuel understood this in the days after the reception room, in the particular way that a person understands something they have not yet put into words, that what was happening was not the kind of thing that gets decided, the way a routing dispute gets decided or a form gets signed. It was more like the way a course correction happens on a long transit. Not a single moment of choice, but a series of small adjustments, each reasonable on its own, that accumulate into a different trajectory, without any one of them being the moment everything changed. The first meeting after the reception room was in the garden. This had been Sova's suggestion, relayed through Reth with the administrative efficiency of a child who has identified her preferred venue and is not interested in alternatives. Samuel arrived at the bench to find Sova already there, investigating something in the overgrowth with the full resources of her attention, and Mara seated at the bench's other end with a container of something hot and the expression of a woman who has cleared an hour in a schedule that does not clear easily and has decided to simply be in it. They talked the way two careful people talk when they have already said something honest and are deciding what comes after honesty. About Sova, mostly her habits, her specific enthusiasms, the interior logic of a child who approaches the world as a series of problems awaiting sufficiently determined solutions. Mara described these things with the particular combination of pride and exhaustion that Samuel was coming to understand was the characteristic frequency of her relationship with her daughter, a signal that carried both at once without either canceling the other out. He listened in the way he had noticed she listened, actually receiving it, doing something with it, not waiting for his turn. Sova found something in the overgrowth that required his immediate attention and got it. The second meeting was in the diplomatic quarter, in a smaller room than the reception room. A working room, with a table and chairs that were comfortable without being ceremonial, which Samuel took as a meaningful change in register. Reth brought tea, and then left with the tact of a man who has recalibrated his understanding of his job responsibilities. They talked for 2 hours. The conversation moved through Sova and then kept going, the way conversations do when the people having them have discovered that the topic was a door rather than a destination. Mara talked about the delegation's work on Velrath, with the directness of someone who has decided that performing vagueness is not worth the energy. And Samuel found that the problems of interstellar diplomatic negotiation and the problems of station logistics had, underneath their very different scales, a structural similarity that made the conversation feel less like two people from different worlds, and more like two people who have been working on adjacent versions of the same problem. She made a remark at one point about a supply chain issue the delegation was navigating that was so precisely the shape of a problem Samuel had solved 18 months ago, involving a documentation backlog and an obstinate port authority, that he spent 10 minutes walking her through the solution with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a person who has forgotten to be careful, because the subject matter has overtaken the situation. Mara listened with full attention, and then said that he had just resolved something her logistics team had been working on for 6 weeks, and that she was going to have complicated feelings about this. He said he was available for further consultation at competitive rates. She said the delegation's budget did not currently include a line for human logistics coordinators. He said Gerald worked for coffee. She said she would take it under advisement. The third meeting was in the station cafeteria, which had been Sova's idea, and which Reth had relayed with an expression suggesting he had raised logistical concerns that had been overruled. The cafeteria was loud and bright and smelled of 17 different food cultures negotiating the same ventilation system, and Sova ate a bowl of something orange that the menu listed as Harvest Grain Composite, Variant 3*, with the focused critical attention of someone conducting a formal review. She delivered her verdict in Velrathi. Reth, who had been stationed at a nearby table with the resigned air of a man doing surveillance on a lunch, translated without being asked. Acceptable, but the temperature calibration was inconsistent across the bowl, which indicated a heating system in need of maintenance. "She's not wrong," Samuel said, looking at his own bowl. "She is rarely wrong about practical assessments," Mara said. "It is the impractical ones I watch more carefully." He knew she meant him. She knew he knew. They ate their Harvest Grain Composite, Variant 3, in the comfortable way of people who have passed the point where things need to be said to be understood. What he noticed, across the 3 meetings, accumulating the way the course corrections had accumulated, was that Sova had stopped calling him the human. Reth had told him this quietly at the end of the second meeting, in the corridor, with the manner of a man delivering information he has decided is relevant even though it falls outside his formal brief. He had said it in the tone of someone conveying that a significant threshold had been crossed, and Samuel had stood in the corridor afterward for a moment, holding this information, understanding its weight without being able to fully articulate why it had weight, only that it did. She called him Samuel now. She said it the way she had tested it on the bench the first day, with attention, with the care of someone for whom a name is not casual, except that the testing was over and what remained was simply the word, used as words are used when they belong to something real. He was walking back from the second meeting through the Habitat Ring corridor, past the viewports that showed Velrath Station's outer surface and the slow rotation of stars beyond it, when he stopped and stood at a viewport for a while. The stars moved in their patient arc. A supply freighter was making its approach to the docking ring on the station's far side, its running lights marking it against the dark with the small practical certainty of a thing that knows where it is going. He watched it for longer than he needed to. He thought about what he could honestly offer and what he could not, and what the difference was between caution and fear, and whether he knew how to tell them apart in himself. He thought about Sova's hands around his in the garden, the absolute assurance of them. He thought about Mara's attention, the quality of it, the specific and careful weight of a person deciding to be present rather than managed. He pushed off from the viewport and walked back toward his apartment, where Gerald was waiting with the patient reliability of a coffee machine that has never once asked anything complicated of anyone. He told Gerald about the freighter. Gerald produced coffee. It was, as always, excellent. 3 weeks after a small girl had sat down beside him and held his hand with the authority of someone completing a long-considered administrative process, Samuel filed the coolant routing dispute. He filed it at 7 in the morning, before the station's artificial light had fully committed to the day, sitting at his workstation with Gerald producing steady and reliable output beside him. The dispute had been waiting for 11 days in the particular way that unresolved things wait, not urgently, but with the low, persistent presence of something that knows it has not been forgotten. He resolved it in 40 minutes, which was how long it had always been going to take, once he sat down and did it. The biological samples had been cleared 4 days earlier, after he had written a documentation summary so precise and so difficult to obstruct that the senior person responsible for obstruction had signed it with the defeated efficiency of someone who has run out of procedural cover. Samuel had felt, upon receiving the confirmation, the mild satisfaction of a problem solved, and then had gone to meet Mara and Sova in the garden, where Sova had found an insect of apparent significance, and the afternoon had been, by any measure that mattered, better than the one before it. He was becoming, he understood, a person with a different shape to his days. Not dramatically different, in the way that stories sometimes require no single morning where he woke up changed, no moment of transformation that announced itself. Just the accumulation of the small adjustments, each one reasonable, until the trajectory was simply different from what it had been, and the previous one was difficult to fully reconstruct. He went to his office and did his work, and resolved the things that needed resolving. And then he went to the garden, or to the smaller room in the diplomatic quarter, or once to a viewing platform on the station's upper ring that Sova had identified as a location of interest, and had insisted on visiting with the combined force of her entire personality, which was considerable. The viewing platform had been, he admitted to himself, extraordinary. Velrath Station's upper ring sat at an angle to the local star that the designers had either calculated or lucked into, and at the right hour the light came across the platform in a way that made the station's structural architecture look briefly, accidentally beautiful. Sova had pressed her hands to the viewport with the focused reverence of a child encountering something that requires her full self, and Samuel had stood beside her and looked at the light on the metal and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thought that had a different quality now than it had 3 weeks ago. Mara had stood on his other side. She had said quietly that Sova had been talking about the viewing platform for 5 days. He had said he was glad they had come. She had said, without looking away from the viewport, that she was also glad, and the way she said it carried the specific weight of a person who means more than the sentence contains and trusts the other person to understand the difference. He understood the difference. On the morning of the 22nd day, which was a Wednesday by the station calendar, and which had no particular significance except that it was the day it was, Samuel arrived at the garden bench to find Sova already there. As she usually was, her attendants at their customary diplomatic distance, the station's artificial sky doing something called asterisk early morning, coastal. Variant 2, asterisk overhead that involved a quality of light Samuel had come to associate specifically with this hour in this place. She was examining an insect with the complete resources of her attention. He sat beside her. She showed him the insect without preamble, the way she showed him things now, not with the performance of a child seeking approval, but with the simple directness of someone sharing something real with someone they have decided is trustworthy with real things. He agreed it was remarkable. It was, in fact, a remarkable insect, some escapee from the station's biology module probably, with the iridescent adaptation of a creature evolved for a planet with a different spectrum of light, its wings catching the coastal morning variant in a way that produced colors that had no names in standard. Mara arrived 12 minutes later with tea, which she had begun bringing in a manner that was too consistent to be coincidental, and that neither of them had remarked upon directly, because some things settle into place better when you don't point at them. She sat on his other side. The bench accommodated all three of them with the same indifference it had always extended to its occupants. The station turned. The light shifted by degrees. Sova released the insect, which departed with the iridescent urgency of a creature that has places to be, and watched it go with a satisfaction that had nothing of loss in it, only the clean completion of a thing properly done. Then she settled back against the bench and put her hand in Samuel's with the ease of long practice, and looked out at the garden with the expression of a person who is exactly where they intended to be. Samuel looked at the artificial sky, which was doing its best, and thought about the freighter he had watched from the viewport 3 weeks ago, its running lights moving with small practical certainty through the dark, knowing its heading. He thought about his workstation, which no longer received invented site inspections. He thought about Gerald, who had been introduced to Sova on the 14th day, and had been approved of with a seriousness that Samuel had found, privately, more moving than he had expected. Mara said, without particular urgency, that she had spoken to the delegation's scheduling coordinator, and that their presence on Velrath had been extended by 4 months, pending the conclusion of the current treaty process, which was moving with the reliable pace of all treaty processes, which was to say slowly and with frequent procedural obstruction. Samuel said he knew someone with experience in documentation obstruction, if it would help. Mara said the delegation's budget still did not contain a line for human logistics coordinators. He said Gerald's rates remained fixed. She said 4 months was, in any case, sufficient time to discuss a great many things. He said it was. They sat with this for a moment, in the comfortable way of people who have learned that silence between them is not absence but presence, and that not every true thing needs to be said immediately to be real. Sova, who had been following this exchange with the attentive patience of a senior advisor monitoring a negotiation that is resolving correctly, looked up at Samuel and said his name. He looked down at her. She considered him for a moment with the dark and steady focus that he had first seen across a garden 3 weeks ago, the gaze of a child conducting a thorough evaluation, except that the evaluation was long concluded, and what remained was simply recognition. The particular and unhurried recognition of someone who looked at a person and saw, without complication, exactly who they were. She nodded once, with the finality of a completed process. Then she went back to watching the garden, her hand in his, the morning doing what mornings do on Velrath Station and everywhere else, continuing, without particular drama, forward. The water feature ran its agenda somewhere deeper in the garden. The bird that had never belonged here pecked at something near the path with the self-satisfied permanence of a creature that has decided, against all structural evidence, that it is home. Gerald waited in the apartment with the patient reliability of a machine that has never once asked anything difficult of anyone, and would not start now. Samuel sat between Mara and Sova in the coastal morning light, and let the station turn around him and did not feel, in any direction he could locate, the particular weight of a life that is waiting to become something. It already was.